am peacock proud and hyena happy to be associated with this week and this day. We're going to have a wonderful conversation with colleagues that are actively investing in the MedTech space, and we'll define MedTech broadly as digital health, traditional medical devices, and diagnostics. In order to get the most out of this conversation, we're going to skip the traditional introductions and dive into this theme and really focus on actionable feedback so that you can come away with this conversation. You can come away with something really of note, of value. So we're talking about trends in MedTech, but we want to ground this in what is happening from an investor's perspective. And we have some great panelists who come from traditional VC, digital health investment, and the angel world. And to start this off, my friend Terri has agreed to take the first question. But we also agreed that we actually can have a conversation. And if Tom wants to jump in or Kevin wants to jump in, not being rude, of course, but has a comment, they will provide their thoughts. And the first one is for you, Terri. What are you looking for in an ideal deal at Epidarex?
Hey, Kwame, good morning or good afternoon to our audience. Great to be here today with LA MedTech Week and UCLA. We really look for disruptive ideas that can transform patient care. So from a MedTech standpoint, we think a lot about therapeutic devices or innovative digital health or AI applications. We really like things that are ahead of the curve, that maybe aren't, fourth or fifth in line in a category, but have the potential to create a new category. It's really important that there's a clear patient population and a clear unmet need that technology can address. And I think we also think a lot about what are the interesting disease categories that really are undertreated, that do have a lot of interest, not only from venture funds, but also from strategic corporations, because as a financial investor, we also have to think about returns and returns in the form of exits. So is it a technology or a disease state that has interest that could potentially see its way to an exit? So those are some of the high level things we think about. We also look early. So we like seed and A round investing, generally around the time of proof of concept. So those things are important. And lastly, I would say we look in underventured geographies. So areas that are less likely to see institutional capital. Those are right up our alley and what we love to do. And we enjoy collaborating with founders and creating companies and building companies.
And so, Terri, what I heard is really transformative technology. Maybe you'll lean more towards de novo or PMA devices, kind of high risk. Maybe you're open to a 510K device. I wanted to turn this to you, Thomas, because as an angel, I want to get a sense, is your aperture wider, more narrow? What's an ideal deal for an angel investor? Just to contrast what Terri's looking at.
Right. So, we come in probably a little earlier stage than what Terri sees. So I would say we're a little more broader and understand that there are certain pieces that aren't in place when they come to present to us. Primarily, what we're looking for is something with good clinical relevance. I mean, I can't emphasize that enough. We see a lot of things come through that you can tell they've found some interesting piece of technology and they actually try to work backwards to find a problem to solve that's not really there. So we like to see something with solid clinical relevance. The other points that we really look at are the FDA. That seems to be FDA clearance. That seems to be a real showstopper sometimes. And more often than not, entrepreneurs will underestimate the amount of time, effort, and energy and money it takes to get something through an FDA. We're of course always looking at the exit. Do the numbers work out? Do the financial projections actually look realistic and reasonable? You can have a great, wonderful technology, but it can still not be investable, either because the valuation comes in too high and it's just not attractive to us. The other things we also look at are the patent portfolio. How strong is this? Because in the end, that's a lot of what we have to go on right now in terms of how this company will protect itself on down the line. And the other really big factor is the team as well. We like to see good, well-rounded teams that have all their bases covered, not just on the scientific side, but on the business side. Does this team have experience in pushing things through? So it's a lot of assessing what's worked in the past and knowing, of course, there's innovation. So we're looking at things that for better or for worse, haven't been explored before, but the general patterns. Do we feel that this company has enough strength to carry it through to an exit? So,
and Thomas is interested in solid, in general, clinical data to support his medical device investment opportunity. Kevin, in the world you live in digital health, is a clinical data set table stakes? Does it have to be a prospective clinical trial? Can it be feasibility data? What gets you excited about a digital health opportunity?
Yeah, and I also do invest in MedTech and biotech as well, and those two worlds are obviously very different from digital health, as you're alluding to. I mean, we've backed just Teams with an idea and a pitch deck, right, on digital health. So ultimately, I think you can get going for usually much less capital and tend to move a little bit faster on the digital health side. So what I tend to look for, other than the obvious things around team that everyone has already spoken to, is also how far ahead the team is thinking about key factors like, hey, does my business, will I have an edge when it comes to working with particular professors and university sponsors to run some sort of clinical studies in the future? If so, are you lining up and speaking with the right future PIs, the right leaders in your field that you're trying to tackle versus, punting that till a year and a half later, at which point, there would have been a lot of other team already who might have reached out to your top list of PIs and they might no longer be available, right? Or other factors like, what is your actual go-to-market and business model? I think that piece tends to be a little bit underappreciated, I would argue, in digital health, especially if you're selling enterprise into healthcare, the world of payers, the world of providers, whether you're talking about large health systems to small independent providers to, the groups and aggregators in the middle versus, what a giant health plan like Anthem versus an association plans of Blues versus, your local smaller plans. Like they all act quite differently. And you need to kind of figure out pretty early on by speaking to those folks, right, who might or might not be the right lane for you to go after and start building those relationships too. So we do look for that a bit, especially during that early customer discovery phase to make sure that the founders are thinking, 2, 3, 4 steps ahead.
And when you talk to founders, Kevin, does that translate into they're estimating the speed in which they can get up and running, right? But it sounds like they're underestimating the time for other parts of their journey. Is that kind of a good...
Yeah, especially on the enterprise side.
They don't get the whole timeline right?
Yeah, it takes a long time to, it's trying to sell into a health system or, integrated delivery network. Well, your pilot might take you a year to get signed up and then the pilot will run for 3 quarters. And I mean, that's your entire seed round time frame, right? So you really need to make sure you're targeting the right customers and then planning ahead because those things can take a long time. To give you an example, I have a portfolio company, that was trying to do something in the mental health space, right? And they were both exploring trying to go towards self-insured employers, which is kind of this tried and true path that's been particularly fruitful, I would say, over the last 5 to 8 years, as well as thinking about going straight to just the larger health insurance companies, right? By the time I invested, which was the founder plus the 2 guys he just hired that week, they already had an advisory boards of some of the top, former chief HR officers, former heads of benefits from big companies like Disney and US Foods. They had already gotten into and got a network into, Optum's leader on the mental health side, right? Like those things you need to start planning for pretty early, and seeing some of those signals from founders is just particularly exciting, especially when you compare, it's all relative, right? And sometimes folks are really planning on not just a year ahead, but 2 to 3 years ahead. And I think that's a great sign for how the team might act going forward.
That's really helpful. I always kind of get a better insight into the go-to-market and really the challenges and how you leverage your advisors. So Terri, tell me what surprised you most about 2020.
Well, there's so many things about 2020, but I think there's a few things. So on the startup side, for younger companies that perhaps are preclinical, I think many of them were able to succeed even in the time of COVID because they weren't needing to be in a hospital setting or a clinic setting. So some of those early R&D phase companies, I think, were able to manage, not perfectly, but a lot of contract R&D houses remained open. We saw a number of the preclinical laboratories remaining open with protocols in place. So I think for us in the seed and the A round phase, companies were largely able to continue working. So that was a nice positive surprise. And I would say on the venture side, I think we as a collective group pivoted to more of a virtual world, perhaps better than I thought. So much of raising money and being a startup company is a lot of face-to-face interactions, it's networking, and traditionally VCs place a high value on that and getting to know people well. And 2020 changed that pretty dramatically. And so I think funds have reached out to each other more, to network, to collaborate, and just generally gotten more comfortable with interactions virtually. And so that's probably a great positive for a lot of startup companies that perhaps have more visibility than they would have if they were fighting for FaceTime.
Thomas, do you want to jump in here? How did Tech Coast Angels change their format? I think they went virtual, right?
Right. Yes. So for the most part, we were all virtual. When this whole pandemic started, we were actually thinking, oh my God, there's going to be a freeze in funding. There's going to be a huge drop off in medical innovation and startups applying to us. But it was quite the opposite. I mean, that was not the case at all. I mean, we actually had some of our strongest companies in history come through on the other year. The other great thing, I mean, there's nothing like meeting face to face and the human interaction. But what we found as a really nice offshoot is our attendance to both our screenings and our pre-screenings actually went up by a lot, just because people didn't have to make the commute. So, and that was a great benefit because now you had a lot more input from varying people with varying expertise. And just a quick example for myself, when I chair the MedTech pre-screen committee, we usually only get a handful of people come in. But during COVID, when we went virtual, I mean, we got dozens, at least 12 people joining our MedTech screening. And it was nice to see members with all sorts of varying backgrounds come to give their input. And I felt that just made the whole process a lot stronger, a lot more streamlined. We had more people willing to step up to do due diligence. And also on the administrative standpoint, we got better as well. So it just really greased the wheel in terms of getting things going and funding deals. So it was actually a nice offshoot of the COVID pandemic.
And is there anything, Kevin, that didn't quite work well? We know that there was an opportunity for a higher volume of diligence, deal flow, but is there anything that you say, man, 2020 really didn't work out as an investor because of this or that?
Great question. I think honestly, one of the tougher things, and this is, I mean, it's hard also because it's very case by case, right? Is to really judge for your own portfolio, what is the right move, right? Should you be cutting costs? If you do cut costs, where are you cutting that cost? What's your competitors doing, right? Mm-hmm. I've literally seen opposite examples, right? Like portfolio companies that cut costs, that really helped save them and allowed them to be leaner. And then they ended up with a growth year with better margins, right? And I've seen other examples. I was literally just talking to another healthcare VC who lamented that for one of his portfolio companies, they decided to cut sales and marketing. And it just so happened that the competitors didn't. And, instead of doubling year on year, they grew only 40%. And now he's worried that they're, going to have a tough time raising money this year. I mean, normally, growing 40% in a tough year, like that's pretty good overall. But if your competition, relatively speaking, did better, and then that creates problems. Right? So I think that's where, I think especially because you had a pretty compressed timeline to make decisions. I'm really talking about a lot of companies had to act in March, April, May, right? by the time you get to early summer already, like that's, 3 months of extra burn you would have just taken on, and the whole world could have fallen apart, right? So like people did make some pretty quick decisions. And, that's why I think everybody was on, daily calls or texting or messaging with the portfolio companies trying to adjust right in real time to what's going on. So that was certainly not easy. Ultimately, I think some of those will have pretty long-term repercussions for some of the companies. And I think that's kind of the hard thing that I felt was a bit of that black swan event.
Yeah. Terri, what do you think about that? Because I noticed that some companies were frozen, they were paralyzed, and they didn't make decisive decisions in March, April, May. Mm. Some made decisions to put fundraising on pause. As you reflect back on it, do you think of something that was a mistake, a strategic mistake? Like, for example, putting fundraising on pause for Q3 and Q4 of 2020, or something like that,
Yeah, I guess I would echo Kevin's comments. Really, March, April, May, companies really had to hunker down quickly. Really think about their burn, think about their runway, and assess fundraising. So I think the companies that were decisive in general probably are doing a little bit better because they didn't wait. I think I've seen companies very successfully think about their financing strategy and perhaps take an insider bridge round or extend an A round just to deal with the uncertainty of knowing when they could get back into the market and fundraise. I've seen really good use of venture debt for some companies with some really favorable terms in 2020. So I think the companies that didn't take their eye off what they needed to do from an R&D or technology standpoint, but thought about the business implications and thought about how to build in flexibility into their plan to help manage through uncertainty. I think those are the companies that are coming out of this in a better position because they just gave themselves a little bit of breathing room for a year that was highly unpredictable.
Can you talk, what's venture debt? Because there quite candidly may be a significant number of people on this call who've heard the term, don't even know if they're a good candidate for it. Let's explain it for the people.
Yeah. So it's a really interesting way to finance your company. I think it's important to know that as many people as you talk to and ask about, you'll get that many opinions about whether it's good or bad. So it's one of those areas that people generally have strong opinions about, either in favor or against. It's a way to essentially take a loan from a bank with certain terms. Perhaps you don't have to draw the money right away, so you can potentially time some of your draws to milestones or things that you're thinking about for your business. It's a way to take pretty non-dilutive money on a relative basis. So if you're not ready to raise an equity round. And then the last thing I would say about it at a high level is that you tend to be more qualified for venture debt shortly after you've raised an equity round. So the more money you have in the bank, the easier it is to get venture debt. If you are trying to get venture debt when you're short on cash and let's say you have 6 months of runway, you're probably not going to get it. So it's a little bit of a catch-22 in that if you've just closed an equity round, you might think of it as an insurance or an option bet. If you, for example, thought, well, what if I could go faster in my commercialization and need a little bit more cash? Or what if I have an uncertain event? So I think different companies use it in different ways, but it can give you an option bet.
And
just adding on to that a little bit, I would say I kind of think of venture debt as really the bank, like whether it's SVB, Comerica, kind of the usual suspects. I think they're really banking on the VC is kind of that whole business model. If you look at when people raise venture debt, tend to be pretty short amount of time after you have raised a new funding round in equity. And usually, it doesn't go beyond, let's say 20% of however much you raise in equity, right? So if you raise 10 million, banks are usually comfortable giving you $1.5 to $2.5, $3 million in venture debt. And it's a good deal in the sense that it's a low interest loan. Usually it's just prime plus maybe 1.5 points. usually give you a interest-free period, and you don't have to draw it for the first 2 quarters, 3 quarters, a year, whatever. They get a little bit of warrants in your company, but it's a de minimis amount, so it's really not dilutive in a meaningful sense. But on the other hand, it is still debt, right? So ultimately, they're looking to the VC to be saying, hey, look, should the company hit a bump in the road, I hope for our working relationship with you VCs, especially since probably SVB also banks said VCs, it's like, hey, if you know that your cash is going to dip below what you owe us in venture debt dollar, then you would make a conscious decision to whether it's cut cost or putting more equity dollars into the company, or frankly even if you really have to shut the company down so you can at least return the debt, right? Like those are kind of some of the realistic concerns and downsides that do happen that people don't usually talk about when they take venture debt. People usually just say that, hey, look, it's like I raised 10 and now I got a 20% bonus on the round I raised and I can use it however I want. Yes, only if things are up and to the right, and then you raise more money, at which point then great, people want to give you even more debt, right? So anyway, that's just my quick 2 cents on that.
There's risk for sure.
Thomas, angels don't really deal with exotic instruments like venture debt, do they?
No. Sure.
And I just I wanted you to say that for contrast. And I think you said it, Terri, but if you wouldn't mind, or Kevin saying it again, venture debt is usually an option when people just finished an A round, a B round. What would you say is a timing for venture debt?
Could be any round of equity. I think Kevin's exactly right. If you think about it as a rough percentage of how much you raise, you're about to go commercial with a big product, you could bring in quite a bit of venture debt. Maybe it's 10 million or more. So it can really come after any round. The banks are generally really good partners. It comes down to, do you have a strategic need for this? Do you understand why you're accepting it and how you would spend it? I think that's really important because there are downside risks to it. And you need to know that and think about that. And Kevin's right. It comes down to your venture partners. If your investors are comfortable with debt and they're willing to support you through it, it can be a great option. But not all venture funds like debt because debt is senior. And so it really, it's a company by company conversation. And I always say, really understand how you would use it strategically and why.
Yeah, I think that'll tweet, Terri. I don't know if we have someone manning social media, but I love that, what you just said. Debt is senior. Not all VCs like it. You have to be strategic. I think I get that. I wanted to let everyone know that we have.
Sorry, Kwame.
Yes.
I just we had a relevant question, so I wanted to jump in and ask it.
Yes.
From the audience, are any of you all seeing revenue financing?
Are you specifically referring to like accounts receivable financing? Like, there's a lag before you get you collect the cash from your customers? Because that's pretty common and is a very good instrument to help you bridge any kind of cash flow shortfalls.
Yes, that was the question that was being asked.
We're generally too early as investors, coming at seed or A to be at a revenue stage.
Yeah, from our standpoint, we are lucky if the company is even in revenue at our stage. So.
But it is funny that I got brought up because literally today, because there's been a couple of new startups that came out to try to reinvent this part of the financial stack, other than just regular banks. Sorry for the loud noise. But like, for example, if you look at a company called Pipe that just announced they raised some money today. They were, instead of just banking on accounts receivable, right, that that the cash is coming in, they're actually trying to finance your SaaS revenue on the basis that because it's recurring and pretty steady, we'll give you basically, loans on like short-term loans on top of that as well. So that let's say you're going to get $10 million in SaaS, we'll count 90% of that and happy to front you 90% of that to bridge your cash flow. So that part of the stack is definitely getting a little bit more innovation and it's changing up a bit. Again, as usual, a lot of the things that a bank would do ultimately if you had a good banking partner and if you have the relationship and you have the traction, I think you're seeing some of the startup fintech world trying to make that a bit more accessible to others as well, for good.
Let me ask about a trend that isn't so new. Fundraising platforms. Some are dilutive, some are non-dilutive. do you have an opinion? Does your fund have a policy, a general belief about whether they're good for the cap table, net neutral, positive? Who wants to start? What do you think about these fundraising platforms?
Kwame, can you clarify what do you mean by fundraising platforms?
So a company wants to raise anywhere from 200,000 to even $1 million with individual money who may or may not be accredited investors, and they hop on. I don't want to name any names, but you know what I'm talking about. Do you guys like them, Kevin, Terri? What is Epidarex thing about these platforms?
I mean, generally for our investments, we're usually first institutional capital in. We're early investors. We'll invest directly in a company, and the rounds are not so large that we would need to go kind of beyond the groups that we typically like to invest in. So it's not something we generally really see at our stage. Understood.
Yeah, if you're referring to crowdfunding, is a little bit of a bonus, but we don't put a whole lot of value in that because we know the dynamics of a little different, and we will probably be delving into the company a little more than, say, somebody on any kind of crowdfunding platform would be. I mean, it's a plus, but it doesn't carry a super amount of weight. So.
Kevin, do you guys have an opinion about?
Yeah, same. I mean, I think, from first principles, right? You want to make sure, ideally, that every investor, anyone listed on your cap table is potentially a value-added investor. Is excited about your company, has no other conflicts of interest, et cetera, right? And when you go out, say on a crowdfunding platform, you're really collecting a lot of different investors. And at the end of the day, I think the one kind of real argument I've heard, and it has worked here and there, is sometimes you're going to your customers, right? Like it could be that those retail investors are your customers, and so kind of like what people do with direct listings and things like that. In those sense, there could be some small value, but ultimately at the end of the day, I tend to treat it more as just money, and relative to other sources of capital, tend to be a little bit harder to get value out of, just because it's so many different folks with small dollars.
Yeah, that's a really good point. For startup companies, think about how are you going to manage your cap table. So it is, all things being equal, if you have choices, you generally want money with, that brings benefits to you as a company, either network, collaboration, experience, things that will help your company grow and develop. And you generally want to see your equity holders aligned. So you don't, the busier your cap table, the more investors you have, it's harder to manage, just frankly, as a CEO or as a company. And so having alignment amongst your equity holders makes things a little bit easier.
Hey, Terri, I have to jump in and tell you, Paul Grant gave us a shout out, said your last quote was tweetable. You did another one. The busier your cap table, what is that? The busier your cap table, the more you have to manage. Boy, we need to do a social thread here.
I think that's really what Kevin's alluding to, right? Is that you need money, but be thoughtful about the kind of money you take, because. But
let me push a little bit though. Let me push. So you know the mind and the life of an entrepreneur. There's obviously smart money and dumb money, but in the end, money is money. So let's play out a typical scenario. CEO has been at it, first time CEO, been fundraising for 8 months, has a physician. Physicians may or may not be smart money, right? Let's be real about this. But they want to stroke a check for $250,000 and it's going to close out your $1 million round. Do you turn it away? What's your reaction to that?
I think if that's your best source of money, and it's a difference between staying afloat or not, you take that money. So I'm not saying walk away from money, but understand what different money brings you. Yes. But yeah, as an entrepreneur, you want to keep your business moving forward. I would say at a higher level, though, I would want CEOs and founders to really think about their value proposition. Thomas talked about this at the outset of the panel around what need are you really going after? And to be successful fundraising, I would encourage everyone, Google what a value proposition is and really work on it, especially if you're a scientific or technical founder. Pay attention to this because it matters in how you pitch, and it's what a lot of people look for. And I'm curious what Thomas thinks, because you probably do see physicians with $250,000.
Right. I think a lot of this also depends on the health of the company at this stage. I mean, how desperate are you for the money? And you're also looking at how is this physician going to interact with you? I mean, is this physician in the specialty, for example, of what you're trying to develop? If that's the case, and it's almost a win-win because he also brings expertise. Now, if you're talking about someone that's not familiar with the specialty, then you're probably a little more leery. I mean, you at our stage, I mean, $250,000 is a sizable check, and at this point, I think you're really looking for, is this guy going to cause any trouble? I like the comments about kind of limiting your cap table. I mean, when we see companies that all of a sudden they're going to have a huge cap table, I mean that's a headache, and you're going to have you're going to get in a situation where you're herding ants, and that can muddy the waters when you try and go to an exit. But yeah, that's my 2 cents on that.
Dina, I think we have some questions from the audience.
We do. So we had a couple of questions about raising money and valuation models when you're very early stage, prior to significant revenue, or if you need significant funding to get through regulatory processes.
What do you think, Terri?
Yeah, it's a great question. So very early stage companies often are far from market or have significant clinical trial costs that they need to think about. So I always say begin with the end in mind. Who is your clear patient population that you think you can go after first? What is the size of that market? What products, if any, are out there today? What do they charge for those products? So think about the business case that you're trying to make and why your product would be successful. And think about the whole life of the program. What do you need in this particular round? Let's say it's an A round versus what might you need. And for a venture fund, we're really looking at the life of the company and how long it might take to get to what we call a value inflection point. Maybe it's first in human data, or maybe it's a pivotal trial or a 510(k) clearance. So really start to think about those value inflection points for your company when you might begin to see an exit, and then try to think about comparables, because venture firms always think about comparables. What similar types of companies have exited and for how much? And that makes the modeling easier the more data points you have, or perhaps the more logic you have or thoughtfulness about it. There's no right answer per se, but having a good thought process and having some data and being able to triangulate what the value of your company might be is kind of how I would encourage people to think about it. It means if you're a technical founder, you really have to put thought in here, because it might not be your natural sweet spot, or you need to partner with someone who can help you think through the business side.
Yeah, just really piggybacking off of that, one of the more troubling trends we've seen just over the last year is just the large jump in valuations of companies coming to present to us, and that's often made it uninvestable for us. We a lot, just as a very big ballpark, we usually don't invest in anything over 7 or 8 million at the angel stage. You have to realize that for us, if you come in with a too high a valuation, and more oftentimes than not, it's not justifiable. These companies aren't in revenue; they don't have FDA clearance, and they're coming up with these whopping valuations that we're not just going to get our money back on down the line. So it's something where you, as if you're a really early stage entrepreneur, you really have to think that, okay, you're going to maybe have to give a little bit on the valuation to get any money at all to come through to you. But it's certainly a big roadblock for us. And we've seen a lot of companies that otherwise look fantastic that we just couldn't invest in and turn down because it just didn't make financial sense to do so.
And my takeaway is angels have price sensitivity. It's in that 7 to 8 million round. I think Techos Angels is typical of most angel investors, and institutionals may have more flexibility on pre-monies, but still there is a range. But when you're first getting started, I think the takeaway is, unless you're in Northern California, your pre-money will probably come in at the seed stage under 10 million, maybe closer to 7, 8. If anyone wants to disagree, please do.
The only thing I would add is, picking off of all you guys' points, is I tend to think about it from every investor, right? To your point, what Tom just said, like every investor has their own thresholds. And really, I think it behooves founders to understand ahead of the meeting a little bit about what is the typical check size and ownership requirements for said fund. Some funds are not driven as much by ownership, right? Some funds are more driven by return multiples, and they just want to know that, hey, if I think, even if this is a high price, but I think that you can still return 10x, then, and there's other investors in the round, then they might just be willing to pay a higher price. Whereas others are, whether you want to call them more disciplined or they have a particular portfolio strategy that they're building towards, they might not want to go above a certain threshold. Even things like, hey, that fund might be in its last year, right? Like typical funds are 2 to 3 years. That actually has an impact as well sometimes, because you would have planned your portfolio to say, I want 20 companies. I only have 15 now. I kind of need to almost rush to make 5 more investments. Do I make 1 big investments that equal 5 investments, or do I, make 5 investments, right? And that's where they might be swayed slightly more to 5 smaller checks, right? So that because they feel like they're not meeting their portfolio diversity. So every investor is a little bit different in each of their, unique time point. And it's not that hard to figure out what that is. 1, you should ask them directly on the call, right? And 2, try to figure out who else they've backed. Even if you have a friend or you have your own subscriptions to Crunchbase or PitchBook, you can find a lot of this information online as well. Look at some of the more recent data points to understand kind of where they sit. So that's one thing. And the other thing is, last year was we are at a market high, right? I think everyone sees that, and you see it from, public markets to SPACs all the way down to first rounds with founders raising 5 on 20 pre for a seed round. It's pretty wild out there. And I would just caution again, what all of you guys said, which is it's nice to get a really great price. You might feel great today, but you also should think a little bit about the future, right? If you have a really high price, you got to live up to it for your next round. And sometimes, it can be extra challenging for you to try to then live up to that. And if you don't live up to it, last thing you want is a down round, or more likely, you're just going to have a hard time raising that next round. People expect more when you have more money and higher prices. So definitely something to consider as well.
Are there more questions, Dina?
There are. So how much does U.S. government agencies' interest in a particular disease or patient population affect your evaluation of an innovation? And if it does, how can innovations for rare diseases and or small patient populations with little U.S. government interest get funding?
So I like to take a stab at this for 60 seconds. We were just reviewing our portfolio, and one of our portfolio companies, Advocate, enables mental health treatment. And one of our conversations was, this moment is a wave for companies that are in this space. The Surgeon General's #1 priority is going to be better mental health for the US population. So at least for Wavemaker, we do look at mega trends, what's going on in the environment, and how our portfolio companies are helped by the US government or hindered. We have a rapid PCR test system, and we believe the government is going to help. We actually know that for several reasons. So we do factor it in at Wavemaker.
Yeah, this is a really good question. There's a lot of factors with this. #1, people, when the government really takes interest in these things, a lot of time there's non-dilutive funding, and that's always very, very beneficial. And you're obviously also targeting usually something that doesn't, where there isn't very good treatment for, or it's an orphan, or it's a rare disease. And, so the human benefit of that is really, really well. And those are all positive things. Unfortunately, a lot of times when we do see several companies like this, the negative impact is that it's always a concern of the market share. Okay, you address this market. How financially feasible is this, and moving forward? And that's always something that we really have to evaluate. And if you're an entrepreneur in this space, you need to frame it that either this orphan drug, they're going to pay so much for it, or the orphan device or whatever it is, they're going to pay so much for it that you will achieve a reasonable, valuable exit, or find some way to pivot your technology to also address something else on down the line after you've taken over and you've conquered the problem, the medical problem you're trying to treat initially. So we'd like to see these companies. Unfortunately, it's a pretty tough uphill battle getting to that point of funding.
I think also there's just extra onus on the founders, right, to educate us as well, right? Like we might not know much about that indication, et cetera. And that's where, not only if you know a lot about it, but let's say you did find that, rare disease foundation that's related to this, or that patient advocacy group for this disease, and you have their support and they're interested in helping you, whether it's grants or non-dilutive capital or access to, their members for potential future clinical trials. Like those are all, extra bonus points that show like, hey, this founding team really care about this. They have dug in a lot. They know so much about it, and that's exciting to an investor. Then they want to learn more about it, right? So that's also, I think, to me, a big part of trying to go for something that's maybe not as obvious.
Shall I shoot you another question, Kwame?
Yes, shoot.
All right. I shouldn't have used that terminology. So there's a question about increase in industry trends associated with implantable devices? And if so, are there technical challenges impeding the adoption, particularly in terms of an implantable device combined with digital health?
Terri, what's your reaction to that question?
So there's definitely we're seeing an intersection now of more implantable devices with some sort of intelligent machine learning, AI, digital health component. I think it's really interesting because you see device companies moving towards software perhaps, and then you start to see some software or technology companies starting to move towards medical devices. So I think it's just a really interesting area to watch. There certainly are different regulatory hurdles or challenges to be thoughtful about and to make sure you understand. So with these types of companies, I always suggest understand your regulatory strategy early, understand your testing requirements, understand kind of how you will be viewed by the regulatory authorities, whether it's FDA or otherwise. But I actually think it's a really interesting trend that's continuing, but important to understand kind of what all your technology will require, and then what is the business strategy. So where will it fit in practice? What is it solving? Why is it better? Why is it different? Those become really important questions.
Yeah, on top of all this, we are seeing a little bit of an uptick in this. To us, the main challenge of this is the adoption. Implantable devices do carry some risk with them, and more oftentimes they're not. It's not that really big a jump in technology. The other crucial thing is the data that you're gathering from when you're melding the digital and the implantable. The data you're gathering really isn't that useful, and it's a nice to have. It's not need to have, and the only way physicians are usually creatures of habit, and the only way you really change that is to come up with something so game changing, so necessary that it becomes kind of standard of care. And to me, that's the main challenge with a lot of these implantable devices trying to combine with the digital platform. So,
I want to ask a potentially challenging question, and whoever wants to jump in, please do. So, implantable device, high risk PMA device. What are the chances that CEO who took it from pre-seed to Series A is the CEO that takes it from Series B to Series E or to acquisition? Can you talk about that and how pre-seed CEOs negotiate transitions when they occur?
Yeah, I'll take a stab at it. I would say it depends on where the exit point is for the company. If it's a really innovative technology that, for example, a lot of strategic corporations are interested in, and they might want to acquire something after early first in human data, probably that founder, early CEO will be with the company through that point. If the technology is going towards full pivotal trial and commercialization and scale up, many times there is that transition somewhere around the B round to we'll say is a more business-oriented CEO, and it completely depends on the founder. The founder could be a business-oriented person, but if the CEO is really a technical founder, usually as you start getting into bigger rounds of financing where you're looking at maybe $30 million for a pivotal trial or more, and you're thinking about a big scale-up, having someone at the helm with that kind of experience ends up being very valuable. So I've seen those transitions go well and not so well. It just depends a lot, I think, on the investors. I think it depends on the personalities. And I think if you're an early stage founder, it's really important to know what you're good at and know where you're not as good or you have less experience, and really keep your eye on what is it that you're trying to accomplish. If you really want this technology to get move forward, get into the market and help patients, really think about what's in the best interest for your company, because certainly later stage investors think a lot about who's running the company.
Kevin, do you have a reaction or thoughts to who drives that conversation? The Series B investor, maybe, to say it's time for a commercialization CEO, founder, it's time for you to step down. Have you seen that going well, go badly? What are your thoughts on that?
Always tough. Hopefully this isn't coming as a surprise to the existing founders and the existing investors and, the big bad, Series B or C investors pushing this on us, right? Like, I think that's certainly not the outcome that you want. I mean, it is something that you got to plan for in advance, right? And I think it's a candid conversation at the board level to really understand what are the goals we're trying to achieve and who's best to take that forward. I mean, as a founder, you should be thinking about who to surround yourself with so that you can hopefully yourself up level to that position. So, you don't necessarily need to replace yourself, or it might work great if you're the CEO and someone comes in as a president or a COO or a CBO who helps you commercialize, et cetera. Right? I think, it's very much a case by case. I think as with anything, it's really big quantitative impact on the company, whether you're talking about how it impacts financings or option pools, right? Or frankly, culturally and qualitatively, which might actually have an even, bigger, longer term impact. So definitely something to, not hide from, but have candid conversations with your board about in terms of what are the gaps we have on the team? How do we fill that?
I feel a lot of pressure to come up with a tweetable saying, because Kevin just said, as a founder, you should think about who you would surround yourself with to up level so that you can be the CEO through the duration. That'll tweet for sure. We have a few minutes left. I wanted to save probably just 2 minutes for the most important thing you think the audience needs to know, Terri, Tom, Thomas, and Kevin. So maybe we can field one more question and then we'll transition to that one thing you think people need to know as we wrap for this kickoff session. Anything juicy, Dina, from the people?
Absolutely. So when an inventor is considering pitching their company to investors, what do they need to worry about in terms of protecting their IP and innovation?
I have. Go ahead. Thomas, you want to jump in there?
First of all, I mean, the IP is kind of almost, you can think of it as a moat, but gosh, there are so many ways to breach that and get around that. I don't want to say don't worry about it. And, it's something that figures into the valuation and how protectable it is, because there are so many ways around it. For us, it's something we definitely look at, especially at the earlier stages, because that's mainly what you have. And it's very, very, very positive to have it, but I would not bank on you being able to completely defend that all the way throughout the whole process of from start to exit, especially if you really catch fire. There will be people gunning to try and get around it and to copycat you. So, we also see a lot of people really paranoid about presenting to us, gosh, I don't want them to steal my idea, and what if this gets out? And, we do try our best to alleviate them. That, we see a bunch of companies, everything is kept within TCA, and, you really don't have a choice with this. You either be brave, go out there and then present your idea, and then if it goes, it goes. But I wouldn't say that don't let the IP concerns freeze you to the point that you're not out there seeking funding. I mean, a great idea is nothing if it ever gets any traction or anything. So
I would just add, be thoughtful. Make sure you filed your ideas. Like, get a provisional in. Like, make sure it's filed before you talk about it. I think that's one way you can just be sure that you've got a priority date. And then for a first pitch, you don't have to talk about everything in excruciating detail. Really, what a venture fund wants to hear in the first pitch is, what's the unmet need? How are you addressing it? How is it different than what's out there today? We're generally not looking for the nitty gritty of how your device works. It's more, why are you different? What value do you bring? Have you thought about health economics? Have you thought about procedure flow? Have you thought about what you're really solving for? And then there's time enough in a deeper diligence phase to learn more, many times under CDA, but a first pitch, you shouldn't be laying out, the secret sauce, so to speak. So it's okay to describe things at a reasonably high level for a first pitch.
Kevin, do you have any thoughts there?
No additional thoughts. Agree 100%.
Yeah. Also, we just have to say, it should be clear who owns the IP. I mean, on our level, we see a lot of people are licensing it from a university or something, and that is always a big factor in deciding whether to invest or not, because on down the road, we don't know how that's going to muddy the water as well. And also, if you've got a great product, a great idea that gains traction, you'll probably progress to the point that you're so far ahead that it doesn't matter if someone steals your IP, or you've already gotten, if it's a truly great idea, you've already captured the market share that you need. People are associating whatever it is with your technology with you. So it becomes, I think, less and less of a factor as you move on. So.
As we conclude, I want to thank you all again for your time. It's been a real joy for me. And I'm going to pick on my buddy Terri to kick us off. What is that one thing that these 200 folks should know, Terri, before we wrap?
I am a commercial marketer at heart. So no matter where you are in your technology development, begin with the end in mind. Really be thoughtful about which patients you're treating, why it's an unmet need, why you're different, better, faster, smarter, whatever it is, compared to other therapies that might be out there, why you bring value to the system. And don't forget the business side. So begin with the end in mind.
Thank you so much. Thomas, what do we need to know?
Yeah, I would say it's important just to surround yourself with a great team. I mean, realize this is truly a team effort. You're going to need a lot of help, and don't be afraid to ask for it. Don't be afraid just to go out there and seek it, because the great thing is, especially in this area, we are surrounded by just unbelievably uber talent everywhere, and it's there. And no, we don't expect anybody to be a master of everything, but we do expect them to be able to work with people, to be able to persevere, and to be able to handle all the roadblocks and the bumps in the road and get around that and get to a successful exit. So, I mean, I think surrounding yourself with good people is important. A lot of angel investors aren't in that field that you're pitching with, especially in the MedTech field, but they are very good at assessing people. And, the old saying is, bet on the jockey, not the horse. And that's very true. Even if they don't understand your technology, they can size you up and weigh and measure you. And then if they feel that you're a good bet, they'll put money behind you. And so, and a lot of that goes with seeing your team and the people that you're surrounding yourself with.
Kevin, you have the last word.
I mean, what Terri and Thomas shared, I 100% agree with. I think maybe I'll just leave with, this is honestly probably the best time ever to start a company. I think there is just so much capital and desire and passion out there to back, the next innovative technologies, the next ambitious teams. And I just want to encourage folks to think about going down that path as opposed to, maybe a more safe or a more conservative choice. I think this is the moment to explore that entrepreneurial streak. And yes, I think don't do it just for building a company's sake. Build it because you really think ultimately your solution can help, that patient at the end of the day, and you know exactly why it helps them. And similarly, it's going to be a long journey. So as early as you can, even if you're in, year 2 of grad school, right? Like, get to know the folks who are years ahead of you, who might have commercialized the company. If you don't know anything about how BD or business works, like, get to know folks just at your school who've done that before. And if you keep building up that kind of, networking and relationship, by the time you do graduate, you'll be that much more prepared to build a company. So never hurts to start a little bit earlier and to go a bit outside of your comfort zone.
Thank you so much, Kevin. Dina, thank you. Over to you. And thanks again for the opportunity.